Hi everyone, and welcome to development. We're starting with prenatal and physical development. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocab. Pause where you need. So we are diving into developmental psychology, which is the study of physical, cognitive, and social change throughout the lifespan. So we're talking prenatal, in the womb, until old age, death. And developmental psychologists, no matter what part of the lifespan or maybe all of the lifespan that they're looking at, they study three essential questions, three broad topics. The first is nature versus nurture, so genes versus environment. The second is continuity and stages, meaning does change happen in one continuous flow or does it happen in clear stages? And then the last thing is stability and change. What about us stays the same over our development and what changes? So the first one, nature versus nurture. Nature is our genes. So what we were born with, our genetic, our DNA. Nurture is our environment. So both of these interact to make us who we are. We are not just our nature and we are not just our nurture. So genes predispose us. Predispose meaning that you might have something in your gene pool, right? Or you might have something in your genetic code, in your DNA. But it doesn't mean that you will experience that thing. For example, you can be predisposed to having anxiety. That does not mean that you will experience anxiety, but it means you're predisposed to it, meaning you're at risk because it's in your gene pool and possibly in your genes. But our nurture, our experience, that takes what nature has given us, those genes, and it forms who we are to be. So maybe you do develop anxiety because of the stressors in your environment. So we're an interaction of those two things. And an important thing to remember, nature and nurture kind of says, oh, this is how we're different and why we're different. But it's very important to remember and to keep in mind that we as human beings are so much more alike than we are different. And I know you can think of a lot of people that you feel very different from, but we have so many more similarities when you step back and think of the human race and think of the shared experiences that we have. The second essential question was continuity and stages. And so we're going to look at three different stage theorists, Kohlberg, Erikson, and Piaget. So we're going to look at morality development, social development, and cognitive development. And they each said that those things develop in clear stages. And other people would disagree and say that it's more of a gradual growth over time. And the last essential question is stability and change. Do things stay the same, such as, for example, our temperament? It stays the same over time. Meaning, well, first let me back up. Temperament is how emotionally reactive we are to something. So if you are someone who gets really, let's say, wound up about something and you like react very passionately, very emotionally, very strong, then that's what we're talking about. You have you are more of an intense person, right? So they're saying that if you are like that now as a teenager, you are probably like that as a baby, and you will probably be like that as an adult. So temperament seems to be stable over time, over as we age. Some things are not as stable though. Our views, our social attitudes, our desire to be social in certain ways, like how we want to be social changes. We tend to become increasingly more conscientious, increasingly more agreeable as we age. So those are just some examples of things that change over time. All right, so now let's switch to physical development. And so remember, we're starting in the womb. So we're starting with one egg and one sperm that meet up and create a zygote. And there are about 200 million sperm racing to meet that one egg, and that one egg being fertilized. So kind of cool. We are one of 200 million, right? Like 200 million sperm race to one egg, and that one sperm fertilizes. And that forms who you are eventually. So we're going to talk a little bit about fraternal and identical twins, because those types of studies come up a lot. So look at this chart right here. Fraternal twins are just as much alike as any two siblings that were born at different times. There were 2 eggs released from the mom, and 2 sperm were fertilizing each of those eggs. So it's kind of just like they share the womb, they share the same genes, same parents, but they are, you're not exactly like a sibling, right? So they have differences. They didn't inherit the same exact DNA, the same exact genes. Whereas identical twins, look at this image here. There is 1 egg and 1 sperm. So they do carry the same genes. They are genetically identical. They're a copy. It splits. See in that second image where it splits? And that's how they become 2 individual people. So the first stage is a zygote. This is the fertilized egg, and this is for about 2 weeks. It's called a zygote. Then it becomes an embryo, and that's from 2 weeks after the fertilization through the 2nd month. So like through 8 weeks. After that, it becomes a fetus. So in the embryonic stage, a lot of things happen. The placenta starts to develop, the heartbeat begins to beat, and again, this is where you could have twins, that splitting of the egg and creating twins. So 9 weeks until birth, it is considered a fetus. And in the 6th month, that's when organs start to develop, such as stomach. And then one of the last things towards the end is lungs, or they continually develop, but they take the longest. All right, so let's move to newborns' physical development. So immediately after they are born, they prefer a woman's voice or the voice of whoever birthed them. So that's the sound that they prefer. They recognize who birthed them. They prefer hearing the language of the mother. So who they were around, like they can hear in the womb. And so that language is the language that is like comforting to them. That's the sound that is comforting to them. And they even cry in a way that we can identify matching the vowel sounds of the language in which they were experiencing in utero. So some babies are exposed to teratogens. Teratogens are anything that can harm the baby while in utero. So obviously this can be things like drugs, nicotine, any sort of like harmful thing that the mom ingests. So one of those things that is unfortunately more common is fetal alcohol syndrome. So this can cause any number of birth defects. It can cause hyperactivity. It can affect intelligence levels. It can create physical issues that are lifelong, mental issues that are lifelong, all sorts of abnormalities. Alcohol. So you are already formed, right? Like you are growing or you are developing in utero. And so alcohol actually affects your genes like after you have been formed. So it has an epigenetic effect. It leaves a chemical mark on your DNA that switches on or off your genes in an abnormal way. And so that's why it affects, it can create physical deformities because your genes aren't actually turning on in a way that they should for you to form correctly. So it leads to certain deformities. So at birth, what can a baby do? So these are reflexes that you're born with, and they fade away as you move away from infancy. You do need to know these. So the first one is rooting. They're evolutionary helpful things for babies. So when something touches their cheek, they turn and they tend to open their mouth, right? Because they see it as food. So they got to survive. So evolutionary speaking, they had a need to, anything that touched their face, they would turn towards it and open their mouth. And related to that, the next one is sucking. That is a coordination of the mouth and the tongue and with their breathing. It's something that babies can do from the moment they are born. Now, premature babies actually sometimes struggle to do this. And so the mother isn't able to breastfeed or bottle feed, and they have to actually train the baby to learn how to do this. This one is the Moro reflex. It's sometimes called the startle reflex. And this is when they hold the baby and they let the baby kind of just fall back into their back of their hand in a safe way. This doesn't seem very safe what I'm doing, but they let them fall back a little bit. And the baby has a startle reflex. And that is basically like they kind of like throw their hands up and they're like, ah, and it looks just like that. And they startle. And it usually, they might cry also. Sometimes they just do it while they're sleeping. If their hands are free, which is why they get their hands wrapped up like they were experienced in utero, because when their hands are free, they'll have that startle reflex and it can actually wake them up if they were sleeping. And the last one is grasping. If you press, see in some of these pictures, if you press on a baby, the center of their palm, they will instinctively, it's a reflex, that they will grasp whatever it is. So again, evolutionary speaking, that was helpful for them. Their hands and their feet both have this reflex. Maturation is the idea that we have these biological growth stages that tend to happen at the same time, and that's a shared human experience, meaning that as humans, we tend to walk around the same age range. We tend to do certain things or think certain ways in terms of our prefrontal cortex being developed, right? So the development of our prefrontal cortex tends to happen around the same time. So here are some examples in terms of motor development, right? We all tend to roll over as babies before sitting up. We tend to crawl before we learn to walk. And then there's that range, right? See, if you look at this chart, there's a range of when we tend to walk or do any of these things. It's not exactly the same day. Identical twins actually do tend to do it on or near the same day. And all of these motor development skills are correlated, now you've learned about the brain, are correlated to the cerebellum, which you can remember is balance and coordination. And there's like a memory connection to those things. So if you think about all of these things, rolling over, sitting up, walking, standing, all of those things require the cerebellum. Okay, and then another example of this is infantile amnesia. So our brains and our memory capacity tend to develop around the same time. So if you try to think back, you might have trouble remembering anything that happened to you before the age of 3. You might have been told stories so many times that about something that happened to you before you turned 3, so you actually think that you have that memory, but it's unlikely that you actually have that first-hand memory, and more likely that someone's told you the story so many times that you've envisioned it. So infantile amnesia is the inability of adults to retrieve episodic memories before that age of 3. So we have implicit memories of knowing how to speak, how to walk, how to talk. All of that stays with us that we've learned before we hit 3 years old. But our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex are not developed enough yet so that we can really store memories. So bottom line here, if you learn anything from this video, don't take your kid to Disney World before age 3 because they're gonna forget. All right, so takeaways. Remember the 3 major debates in developmental psych. Remember that temperament is our emotional reactivity and it's generally stable throughout our entire lifespan. Make sure you know the order of development in the womb. So it's zygote, embryo. Make sure you know the reflexes that a baby can do at birth and understand what maturation is and how it applies to our development. And that sums up mods 12.1 to 12.2, and I will see you in class. Thanks.